All right, welcome everybody to the first webinar for the California Adaptation Forum. We'll just give it another minute or so to folks to hop on. And yeah, thanks for joining. All right, I expect that folks will still be trickling in, but let's just get started. Welcome everyone to the first webinar for Track 1 of the California Adaptation Forum 2021. The kickoff webinar is entitled Harnessing Disruption and Change for the Advancing Equitable Adaptation Tract. My name is Jorge Mak. My pronouns are they and them. I am one of the track facilitators. I'll introduce my fellow facilitators in a little bit. I am the sustainability manager for the city of San Leandro, focusing on both adaptation mitigation within the city and doing a lot of focus on climate justice and equity within the community as well. So the purpose of this tract is really on advancing equitable adaptation. The whole of the California Adaptation Forum will focus on the Grand Adaptation Challenge, exploring key challenges faced by California adaptation community and opportunities to overcome those challenges equitably and creatively. So over the course of the next 4 months, we'll be diving into challenges related to our particular Tract 1 on advancing equitable adaptation, and then generally just facilitating a series of interactive workshops for practitioners to discuss our shared challenges and identify potential solutions. So as mentioned, my name is Jorge Mak. I'm one of the track facilitators. I'm joined by my colleagues Monica Palmera and Nick Tipan. Monica is an analyst with the California Public Utilities Commission, where she focuses on implementing the Commission's environmental and social justice action plan across energy, telecommunications, water, wildfire, rail, safety, and enforcement divisions. Her professional background includes ethnographic research, affordable housing advocacy, climate policy, and community engagement. Nick is a retired high school teacher, a current board member of the Point Blue Conservation Science and Fibershed, and an enrolled member and elder of the Federal Indians of the Graton Frontier. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. He lectures on the variety of topics related to changes to Native American cultural resources, archaeology, and creation of artifacts, and the treatment of Native American cultural resources. So this particular webinar will focus on a couple of different things. First, an overview of key challenges related to equitable climate adaptation, grounding in equity and racial justice frameworks, looking at the past year and lessons learned from COVID and racial justice, as well as their application to climate adaptation. And finally, just embracing uncertainty and how we are creating a new normal and not returning to the conditions that we had before COVID. Just a little bit about webinar logistics. We encourage everybody to use the Zoom Q&A module to type in a question for our panel discussion at any point during the webinar. You can also upvote the existing questions for anything that you would like to see answered. And if you have any technical issues, feel free to chat Julia Kim or Kelsey Wolf Cloud using the chat function there. And now I'll pass it over to Monica to discuss the tract overview.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? You'll hear me? Okay, great. Hi, thanks so much, Faye, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's really great to join you all today. Like Faye said, my name is Monica. I'm with the California Public Utilities Commission, and really grateful to be co-facilitating this track alongside Faye and Nick. And especially want to give them an extra shout out for today. I'm joining y'all from vacation, so I'm going to be playing a slightly smaller role in today's session, and just really grateful for Faye and Nick for stepping up for today in this intro. And I'm really looking forward to joining all of you and for the conversations ahead. So speaking of those conversations, wanted to give y'all a little bit of a sense of the kinds of questions that we're thinking about as we're preparing the track that are going to be informing, the kinds of speakers we invite and the kinds of conversations we're looking forward to having. But of course, today's conversations and the ones that we will have will all also inform, the kinds of things that we'll tee up for you. So, definitely this could always shift, but the kinds of things that we're the challenges related to advancing equitable adaptation that we're going to be looking at addressing throughout the track include how we're going to balance longer term climate impacts with immediate community needs and what that balancing act looks like. Also thinking about how to adapt to climate change impacts while addressing systemic racism and historic and ongoing inequities, specifically white supremacy. We're going to be looking to address that in as direct way as possible. So look forward to that. How to reconcile the need to move very quickly and urgently with also slower and intentional processes that build authentic relationships, cultural competence, or I also like the term cultural humility if folks are familiar with that, and community involvement. So I think we're all familiar with having to balance and hold those two. We're going to be talking about how that plays out in our work. How to build power in place and support existing community leaders in advancing climate resilience initiatives. And lastly, one other thing that we're going to be hopefully exploring in the track includes local government as major players, how to bridge the gap in leadership from grassroots and academia, as well as local and state government. How do we co-lead across all the different areas to make sure that we have an equitable future and adapt to that future? So those are the challenge questions we're going to be looking at, again, in addition to anything else that comes up in today's intro session. So that's it for me. Thank you to whoever was advancing the slides for me, and I'll pass it over to Nick.
Just to echo their comments that this, I hope, will be an exciting and informative and groundbreaking even webinar, and look forward to hearing both of our speakers today. One of the things that I noted in my notes when I was looking at the slides earlier was that we generally, when we think about local governments, we don't often think about tribes as local governments, but they must be considered in looking at what we do and how we do it and who we include in our conversation. And when we include people, other groups, it's important that they be there from the beginning. And that's kind of important, especially to Native people, which I'm a member of the Federated Indians of Great Rancho, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I hope that you are all ready for an entertaining, informative, and exciting time this afternoon. And with that, I think it was Faye, you were going to introduce Brooke.
Sure, I can definitely do that.
Okay.
So Brooke Anderson, her came in the movements for environmental justice and worker rights. More recently, she spent 7 years on the staff collective of Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, EMG. Movement Generation is rooted in vibrant social movements led by low-income communities and communities of color, committed to a just transition away from profit and pollution and towards healthy, resilient, and life-affirming local economies. There, she founded a project called Climate Workers, which was a grassroots labor movement for climate justice. Though she has since transitioned off the staff collective, she remains part of the MG family as she works as a full-time freelance photographer and photojournalism covering local social movements. See her work on Instagram at Movement Photographer. She lives on occupied Ohlone land in Oakland, California. Now pass back to Nick. Nick, I think you're muted.
Yeah, one of our other speakers is Peter Nelson, and I'm happy to introduce him. He's a fellow tribal member of the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria. His specific ancestry is Coast Miwok from the Tomales Bay area. And just another note that at least I sit in the ancestral lands of Great and Rancheria. And I assume Peter's at home, and he as well is in the ancestral territory. Peter's an assistant professor at UC Berkeley in the Department of Environmental Science and Ecology Management. Peter was the former chairperson of the Sacred Sites Protection Committee of the tribe, and was able to create a link between his profession and his passion of being a Coast Miwok ancestral member. He's interested currently in indigenous archaeology, and I'm sure he'll talk more about that, indigenous environmental studies, and community-based participatory research. So as I mentioned, Peter's a member of the Coast Miwok tribe, which is part of the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria. He works at the intersection of anthropological archaeology, indigenous environmental studies, and Native American studies in collaboration with tribal nations and indigenous peoples in California and abroad. And that may sound like a lot of words. It is, they're all big words. He'll explain it more later, but for too long, many Native people have been complaining that anthropologists and archaeologists have kind of ignored the work that we've been doing for generations and centuries. And so now is an opportunity for the people who are studying the environment to catch up with the efforts that Native people have used for centuries. Sometimes you hear the term traditional ecological knowledge, and that's part of something that people are saying might help us address climate change. And that's something that Peter has especially looked at. Some of the things that he's done in recent times is he's directed archaeological and cultural heritage projects in California in various places, especially at Tully Lake Regional Park in Sonoma County, where he did his doctoral work. Peter's also visited many museums in Washington, the Smithsonian, the Kuskokwim in St. Petersburg, and other places in the world. His ongoing eco-archaeological research, he's continuing to do that with the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria, and with the goal that the tribe will begin to co-manage that property, both in terms of cultural resources and natural resources in the very near future. He's also been participating recently in learning more about indigenous land management through prescribed burning. So I'm looking forward to his presentation. And with that, Faye?
Yes, so our first speaker is going to be Brooke. So I'm going to start sharing and let Brooke share their screen.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's really sweet to see all your faces, and thank you so much for the invitation to join y'all today. Again, my name is Brooke Anderson. I use she and her pronouns. I am joining y'all today from East Oakland, from occupied Ohlone land, and speaking as a former member of the Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project. And Movement Generation, I'll go ahead and put our info in here if folks want to learn a little bit more about MG, but essentially MG is rooted in vibrant social movements led by low-income communities and communities of color committed to a just transition away from profit and pollution toward healthy, resilient, life-affirming local economies. And I had the incredible pleasure of spending 6 years on the staff collective, and though I've transitioned off, And just one of those things you're forever part of their political home and political family. So they're taking the month off and asked me, they were really excited and honored to receive this invitation, asked me to step in on their behalf. So I was trying to start a little bit about grounding in myself. I came out of social movements as a teenager in downstate Illinois fighting medical waste incinerators in my hometown. So there were 2 medical waste incinerators attached to hospitals that when they burned plastic and IV and all the things that a hospital generates was spewing dioxin into the air and was poisoning low-income working class communities of color. Folks are getting headaches, nosebleeds, cancer cluster, and we fought back and we won. And I was like, okay, whatever we just did, this thing where we went door to door and talked to our neighbors and fought back and won and made our communities better, this is what I wanted to do with my life. Then I spent 15 years organizing as a worker rights and union organizer, and I was working mostly with low-wage immigrant workers. And in each of these campaigns, I saw how economic transitions driven in response to ecological collapse or environmental injustice, however you want to name it, were hurting workers. So I was working with housekeepers. How many of y'all have ever stayed in a hotel room and seen that little sign that's like, yo, we're in a drought, don't wash your towel? And how many of y'all were like, okay, cool, I won't wash my towel? Yeah, right? So you've seen this. So what do you think happens when a hotel has less laundry? What do you think happens to the housekeepers? Yeah, I see some people there on mute, but they're like mouthing words. So I'm gonna guess that you got the right answer, which is a lot of the housekeepers that we were working with were laid off because there was less work or had their hours lowered to before what the benefits levels were. And obviously we want to save water, but these housekeepers at the same time were like, oh, we're cleaning with harsh chemicals. We are, our bodies are breaking from this work that we're doing. They're like, if you really want to know what it would be like to have a green hotel industry, this is what it would look like, right? I was also working with port truck drivers when new clean air regulations came into effect. And these trucks were spewing toxic diesel fumes throughout West Oakland into the neighborhoods. You could just take a finger and swipe a window and toxic soot would end up on your window. And when the new clean trucking regulations went into effect, you had to buy a new truck. And these were misclassified, so-called independent contractors. And 800 drivers lost their job in a single day when the new clean air regulations went into effect because they couldn't afford the new green clean trucks. And I could go on, but the point of and what happened was it was the large trucking companies that had the capital to invest in new green clean trucks that survived and consolidated wealth and power into fewer and fewer hands. So anyway, the point was that what I saw is that transition in our economy was inevitable, but that the justice in that transition, who gained, who lost, what power was shared, where decision-making was concentrated, whether it was at a high level removed from the consequences of economic activity or distributed down to those who felt those consequences first and worst, was not guaranteed. And it was really going to depend on the social movements that we built. And I know y'all know this, so you wouldn't be doing this work, but just to ground us, reground us as we start off this panel and the severity of the ecological and climate disruption we're facing, I want to just drive the point home by reminding us of something called the lag effect. How many folks, if I can see y'all's videos, I know I can't see everybody, how many folks know about the lag effect? No, okay. So I'll give us a short version. So when we, and I'm doing air quotes if you can't see me, but quote unquote discovered oil in the 1800s, since then we've been doubling fossil fuel consumption every 20 years. And because of what's called the thermal inertia of our oceans, so thermal inertia, big word, but the idea being, think about when you turn your gas stove on to boil water, how that gas, that heat is there for quite a while before the water actually heats up. You can still stick your finger in it for a while. That's how our oceans work, right? Our planet's made mostly of oceans. Because of that, it takes 40 to 50 years to feel the climactic impacts of the current emissions, meaning what we're experiencing today is a function of the emissions that were released before the 1970s. So we have yet to feel the climactic impact and the ecological disruption of all the emissions from 1970s forward. Those are yet to come. So when we look around and we see the hurricanes and the superstorms and the wildfires and the droughts the total disruption of our soil. Think about how many fewer cars, airplanes, air-conditioned skyscrapers were in the world in the 1970s and what's yet to come. So I say that just to really drive home, we know that transition has already begun, but that the transitions ahead of us are even deeper than we can imagine. And we know that we got to this place through, that humans have always modified our surroundings. We've always farmed, terraced our fields, but that his resource extensive production, that it's extraction, right? And that it's industrial, meaning it's a large scale. We're making millions of shoes in one day, not tens of shoes, and not known chain, not local chain, not with the relationships between folks. And it's globalized, right? So where once humans mostly lived in right relationship to home, had developed that traditional ecological knowledge of how much you could hunt, fish, etc., how to be in right relationship with the land and the waters, and letting that regenerate. Where folks may have at times outstripped the resources, they either moved on or died, but the ecological consequences of that activity were small. Mother Earth is tremendously adaptive and resilient. It was a paper cut for her and she healed. But now we have globalized the mismanagement of home. And I wanted to, we're sort of, what I'm getting at, and I'm going to start sharing my screen. I'm sorry, I didn't do this earlier. Let me see if I can do this. Is this interplay between the idea of economy and ecology. And so we got to look, we're like, so these two words have the same root, eco, what does that mean? So we're like, okay, what is this economy? So as folks know, I'm gonna do this quick. We sometimes do like a whole hour-long thing on this, but just as a teaser, and so we have some shared language. Ecosystem is the, is the system and all the relationships of home, right? And logi is knowledge, right? Ecology is the knowledge of home, knowledge of all of the systems of home. So think about all the things that it takes to maintain your home. And you can define an ecosystem as small as a single drop of water to your home, to your neighborhood, to your community, right? And we reject the sort of false political borders, but we know that there's boundaries of ecosystems that are known features in our ecosystems. So what then would economy be, right? We think about it as GDP or a stock market or dollars or whatnot, right? But economy is really the management of home. How are we choosing to manage our relationships to each other and to the natural world that we live in? How are we managing water? How are we managing and governing land? How are we managing everything around poop, right? Or just take literally anything that we have to manage in our system, waste, etc. And so is this, what I'm pointing out is that we have phenomenally mismanaged and globalized a mismanagement of home. And that what we're fighting for is ecological justice, that we have to get into a state of balance between human communities and healthy ecosystems based on thriving, mutually beneficial relationships and participatory self-governance. And at the heart of what it looks like to do this is an understanding that what you do to the people, you do to the land, and what you've done to the land, you are doing to the people. That social inequity is fundamentally a form of ecological erosion. Or to say it another way, social inequity will always lead to ecological erosion, that it is only the exploitation of our labor that has enabled this resource extractive, industrial, globalized mismanagement of home. That's taken our labor and sort of wielded it as a chainsaw against the natural world, and that we have to figure out how to get our labor, reclaim our labor as the sort of first order of ecological restoration, and put that labor back into the web of life. So look and see, how am I doing on time, people who are keeping track of time?
Hi, Brooke, you're doing great. You're at about 10 minutes, but you definitely have more time, so please continue.
It was okay if I take maybe 5 minutes more?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Maybe what I'll do is I'm gonna show this slide, and then I want to talk about one concept that I think coming out of COVID and looking at the crises of COVID, state violence, especially against Black and brown bodies and Indigenous communities, and the ecological crisis. But I'm going to throw this up as a teaser. Feel free to find this on our website. I'll throw it into the materials that we share. But part of what we've developed and we've been teaching on is this idea of looking at an extractive economy, one that is sort of all economies combine resources with work towards some purpose, governed by a worldview, or sort of supported by a worldview, and governed in a particular way. And we have an extractive economy that's based on extraction, exploitation, the enclosure of wealth and power, that's held up and buttressed by this worldview. I'm on the left of this, if you're looking, of white supremacy, patriarchy, consumerism, colonial mindset, and that when you try to step out of line from that system is met with militarism. And we're trying to transition, moving to the right, to a living economy, one where we think about resources with regeneration at the heart of how we, resources sounds to me still extractive, how we think about land and water, right, in a regenerative way, where our work is governed by cooperation toward ecological and social well-being, with caring and kindness at the heart of how we do this, and governed with deep democracy, and really devolving that governance down to the smallest level for what the thing is that we're governing, so that the consequences of those, it's the people on whom the consequences are falling first, are making those decisions. And we have to both stop the bad, right? Fight, the obvious things, the coal mines and the coal terminals and the fracking wells and the pipelines. We also have to build the new. We have to both be visionary and oppositional. I'm gonna stop sharing that and just say one last thing, which is, stop sharing. Okay, hi again. I want to introduce this idea of shocks, slides, and shifts. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think it relates to both COVID, to the onslaught of state violence against Black and Brown bodies and Indigenous communities, and ecological disruption or ecological collapse. So the idea is, shocks are acute moments of disruption. Think on an ecological front. That's my timer. Think on an ecological front, weather events like wildfires, hurricanes, or political events like coups, terrorist attacks, or environmental disasters, right? Deep horizon, etc. Or it could be something like the murder of George Floyd, or COVID, right? A shock is a thing that dominates the 24-hour news cycle and sort of shakes up our political frameworks. If folks have read Naomi Klein, this is what she's talking about in Shock Doctrine. So that's shocks, but slides are slower incremental changes. They're not acute, but they can be equally catastrophic. So think sea level rise, deforestation, the drought, rising income inequality, mass incarceration. On a COVID or public health tip, it's the widening gap of who has access to healthcare, who had to continue to show up to work and be exposed to COVID versus who could stay home and work, who had the resources to shelter in place versus one was unhoused. These are slides, and slides, even though they're slower incremental changes, once set in motion are really hard to stop, and they can indeed cause shocks. And then the third is shifts. So shifts are the cultural and systemic changes we seek, and we have to harness the shocks and direct the slides toward the shifts we're seeking. So, how are we moving from the murder of George Floyd to Black Lives Matter? How are we moving from epic drought and wildfire, at least where I'm at in California, to land back, to Indigenous land sovereignty, to Indigenous stewardship of beneficial fire? How are we moving from the 600,000 COVID deaths to healthcare for all, and an end to this concept that your access to healthcare is based on your work? Some teaser questions. How are we moving from individualism to interdependence? How are we creating opportunities for participatory self-governance in every aspect of our lives? How do we talk about a carbon footprint, but I don't like that because it makes it sound like humans need to shrink back. Whereas I think what we actually need to do is, how do we be in humble cooperation with the rest of the living world? How do we move from monocultures of the mind to seeing biodiversity as our best chance at survival? And then how do we both hold being oppositional, fighting all of the things we know are coming against life, to also being visionary, of creating those small spaces that are the things we know we really want and need to be able to survive? And how do we play at the edges of what's deemed politically realistic, because oftentimes we're told only fight for those things you know you could win, right? And we know it's only when you play outside the bounds of what's deemed politically realistic that you shift what's considered to be politically realistic. And it's actually in those moments of acute shock and when the slides become more evident that it's possible to put forward more visionary, more sort of daring to dream in public about what it would look like to align our worldviews, how we relate to resources, how we organize our work to the purpose that we all are here for, to care for each other and to care for the land. So lots of questions, no answers, but wanted to just throw out some of the things that Women Generation has been playing with and thinking about, and eager to hear remarks from other folks and to just chop it up in the Q&A and the session a little bit later. So sorry for a little bit of the rambliness, but I'll stop here.
Thank you, Brooke, for those thoughts. And I want to remind everybody that through the question and answer app, you can submit questions directly to Brooke for her to answer. That would be appreciated. She just had a few questions for us, and I'm sure everyone has their own answer, and we're happy to share it with everyone else. And I think with that, if I don't screw up again, is we can have Peter start his presentation, and I've already introduced him. And full disclosure, Peter's a friend, so I may have lied a little bit, but not much. Go ahead, Peter.
All right, bear with me while I'm trying to get this to go into the presenter mode. Let me try something else. I don't know what that did.
It looks good.
Great.
It looks good. Okay. Yeah. This is a little bit weird because I can't see it. I don't know what I did there.
Well, we can see your slide, Peter.
Okay. It might just be a problem if I can't advance them. That's the only thing I'm concerned with. But let's see.
Would you like me to share your slide? I have
Yeah.
the PDF. Go ahead and do that. Sorry, give me 1 second because I need to navigate in the PDF document.
Sure.
Here.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, I don't know exactly what happened there, but yeah, so as Nick said, I'm a assistant professor in environmental science policy and management, as well as ethnic studies at UC Berkeley, and I'm a tribal citizen of the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria. I'm presenting today from Santa Rosa in my home and homeland, Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo Territory. And my family is from the Tamaulipas Bay area, and a lot of our families came from there. It's probably, too short of a presentation space to get into the full history and background of what's happened here in California or even locally. But, a lot of us have been moved around in different ways and removed from certain aspects of our tribal lands. because of the Spanish missions, the Mexican ranchos, and later the American period beginning in roughly 1850, there were treaties in California that were drawn up and then shelved and never ratified in California. So it creates a political climate with tribes that's a little bit different than some other regions in the country. And so there are a lot of particularities and unique situations that make California a really special case in the history of Native American relationships with the government, especially here. All right, getting into the presentation, I'm going to start at a moment when I arrived here, back in Santa Rosa. I worked three years down in San Diego at San Diego State University, and I just got a job at UC Berkeley this past year, and I moved up just in time for the a few of the fires in the last fire season. One of these was the Glass and Shady fires in Santa Rosa, and this was the view from my house during those fires. Unfortunately, this is a view that we get more often, in these past few years than we ever have before. And hopefully this doesn't, keep happening with such frequency in the future. And I'll suggest a few ways that we can, manage what's going on with all of these wildfires that are breaking out. But at least right now, with changing climate, with all of the fuels and the ways that our wildlands have been managed in the past, this is the sort of perfect storm, if you will, of wildfire that we're getting. We have tons of accumulated fuels, we have drier conditions and drought, really hot summers, and you put all those things together and we get these massive wildfires. So if we go to the next slide, I got a chance to work with some really great people in the Audubon Canyon Ranch Fire Forward program and the Good Fire Alliance, and we had a chance to get some experience getting certifications like the firefighter type 2 certification, and experience on prescribed burns and also wildfires. And so we worked on one of these, the Walbridge fire, last year. And as you can see throughout this pygmy Sargent cypress forest, it's just massively destructive to a lot of these different areas, just wholly burning out a lot of different places, not only destroying ecological areas, but then also property and people's homes, and especially along the interface with more urban areas, as we've seen in Paradise and some other towns, really massive levels of destruction of property. Some of these areas really do need fire, and the ecology of these areas encourage that in some cases, but we want to reduce the amount of wildfire that's ripping through these areas that causes so much damage and makes these areas uninhabitable for people, as well as some animals and others, for many years to come. It takes a long time to regenerate these different places, as opposed to selectively thinning out different areas and keeping old growth around. If we can continue to the next slide, this just will show in the Armstrong Redwood State Park, doing some of the work of cooling down some of the old growth redwoods to keep them around and keep them from dying in this Walbridge fire. And so we were actually putting up sprinkler systems to cool them down and get the fire out of these cat faces, so that those old growths would survive, and then the fires would burn around those huge trees and burn out some of the foliage. So the wildfire actually did help out in that sense of doing some of what we should be doing through prescribed burning, which is taking care of some of the fuels. We just don't want the wildfire to take everything. So we need to be more proactive in putting fire on the ground ourselves rather than letting lightning strikes and human activities provide that spark for these massive fires. If we can go to the next slide. All right, so the natural cycle of things is essentially you have different vegetation types. You start out with relatively open areas and grasslands. Larger plants, shrubs, and other things encroach on these grasslands, push out some of the grasses. Then you get larger plants still, the woodland trees, and eventually dense conifer forest. In order to break up that dense conifer forest, you need some type of disturbance, which is usually fire, and then that cycle restarts again. If we can go to the next slide. And then, so usually that type of disturbance naturally is being caused by lightning fires. In Central California, this shouldn't be the case except in very rare circumstances and not for a very, very long time. So there's a very low frequency of lightning strikes and a very long period of time between when you have those lightning ignitions that cause these wildfires. And then if we can go to the next slide. What that means is that in this area, you should have really, really dense forests if nothing is done. But the situation here is that we have lots of coastal prairies and extensive grasslands. And so the reason why we have these, if we go to the next slide, is because we also, for many, many years, have had indigenous stewardship of these different open areas. And so you have Native people doing cultural burns, managing areas in different ways to increase the productivity and abundance of different ecological areas for food, medicine, basketry, and other things. And so that management and that cultural burning is an integral part of people's interaction with the landscape and making it habitable for people to be here. If we go to the next slide. And so when you don't have that same management, you get droughts and other things. These resources that indigenous people use are impacted. And so here you can see drought really drying out an area where you can see willow in the background. And if we go to the next slide, we'll zoom in on some of that willow. Willow is used for basketry, but and you need nice long straight shoots of that willow for really good basketry material. But when you don't manage it, you don't prune it, coppice it, burn it, you get bugs that grow, basically live inside, get inside of the sticks of the willow and create these really bumpy willow sticks. So this resource really, really needs management. And when you don't have that, it gets these bugs. It also gets laced through with poison oak and other sorts of shrubs and things that make it really difficult to get in and do that management ongoing. If we go to the next slide, I'll just show really quickly another resource type that has been seeing some serious impact, seaweed and kelp. On the next slide, I just have a few facts of what's been going on there. You may have heard of the sea urchins that have been eating a bunch of the kelp and making the kelp forests really unhealthy, reducing the number of kelp out in our waters. And part of that has been this due to a number of different factors, and probably most prevalent of those factors is the natural predators, the sea otters and the sunflower stars aren't keeping the urchins in check. And so you have this overabundance of sea urchins that are now impacting that kelp. And kelp and seaweed, other types of seaweed are traditional foods, but also in the kelp forests, it provides habitat for fish and other animals that are used by indigenous peoples here. If we can go to the next slide. So here we have tan oak. Tan oak is a major food source for Native people here on the coast. It's also been heavily impacted by sudden oak disease. On the next slide, I just, have listed a few facts about that. And one of the considerations in management is that a lot of this impact to tan oak specifically has left a lot of dead standing trees that become snags. And that's really dangerous because it's this clutter of fuel that gets up into the canopy of these forests. And if it's left alone, then if a wildfire breaks out in these areas, it already has this really flammable fuel all laced all throughout the forest. So managers may prefer to select these tan oak trees for thinning, and when they're gone, replace them with other species of oaks or other trees rather than trying to repopulate them with tan oaks that are susceptible to the sudden oak death. But that impacts our cultural traditions and traditional foods and the access to those traditional foods that we used to have. So that's an ongoing impact of climate change on our communities on the coast. And if we can go to the next slide, so putting fire back on the ground has all these benefits for staving off sudden oak death. It may not stop it necessarily, but getting rid of the fuels, spacing out the forest, opening it up a little bit may keep it at bay a little bit longer. It gets rid of these fuels that accumulate in our forests and reduces the amount of those fuels that result in these massive wildfires. If we can go to the next slide. So, when we're considering the types of management that are available to us, we need to consider a number of different things. First is, our values and perspectives and the assumptions we have. I talked a little bit about that with tan oak and, the types of resources that we target for removal. We need to think about what the idea of wilderness area is and, how that has constructed this perfect storm for wildfires to happen in our wild areas as opposed to actively stewarded and managed areas that are still beautiful and abundant, but they may not necessarily be this separate human space, separate nature space. Those values really impact the way that we manage these lands. Also, the best available science that guides those management practices, whose perspectives are embedded in that quote unquote best available science, and who does that exclude and whose knowledge does that exclude? Oftentimes, that may exclude traditional ecological knowledge, even though now we're bringing more of that into that science that is accepted by land managers and park systems. And then, who's served by the different efforts that we have going on? Are we focusing on the wildland-urban interface? Does that exclude people in more rural communities? Do we work more with private landowners who are generally white and more affluent because it's easier in the permitting process to work on private land versus public land and parks that have to go through a more rigorous permitting process? So these are all considerations in how the resources that we have get structured to help certain groups of people as opposed to others. And if we go to the next slide, this will be wrapping up here. Some solutions that we need to think about is working a lot more closely with tribes. There are some agencies that are really good with this, some others that may need a little bit more work in working collaboratively on land management and stewardship issues with tribes. Providing resources for training. There are lots of TREX programs nationwide to get training in prescribed burning. But then there are also local programs. A really good example is the Good Fire Alliance and Audubon Canyon Ranch's Fire Forward program. They have classes and are trying to build a community of fire practitioners in the local area. It's an excellent model. Also community science and research. And I've listed a couple of programs in this slide where, the Fire Forward program is engaged in different research on the effects of fire on ecological resources, and then also another program, the Sonoma Safe Agriculture Safe Schools, or SAS, is investigating chemicals and pesticides and their use in Sonoma County and how that impacts the community there. And then both of those programs are involved in different ways in reducing the fuels, in the community to make the community more safe, and specifically developing the community's capacity to do it for themselves. Communal grazing programs, shared stewardship, and prescribed burning services that they provide for each other. So partnering to get these things done on the local level, as well as partnering to apply for grants and funding and reduce the cost for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford doing this sort of management. And then if we go to the last slide, I just wanted to show a picture of the last burn I was on, which was this past Thursday. So we're pushing the envelope with Northern Sonoma Fire and Audubon Canyon Ranch in terms of what we're able to do in terms of burning really late in the season. A decade ago or more, you wouldn't have ever thought of being able to burn in the middle of the summer, especially when it's as dry and hot as it is now. But under certain conditions, this can be a perfectly executed burn, which it was. It was an evening sunset burn, so the humidity as we started continued to drop right into the nighttime. And, this just allows us even more flexibility to get these burns done, to reduce fuels around the county, and to extend those resources and services throughout the year in order to keep these fuels in check and get the work done. So anyway, thank you for listening. I know I went a little bit over time, but I'd be happy to answer questions in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Again, for those folks who are listening and have questions, please use the question and answer button at the bottom of the screen to submit your questions, and I think our speakers would be happy to explain their positions. So I kind of have a question. At one point in time, I was the tribe's liaison to national parks, and one of the issues that came up at Point Reyes is the restoration of wilderness areas in the park. So being kind of a disturber, I asked them to define wilderness for me, because we talk a lot about restoring this and doing that and doing that. And for a lot of people, it's not clear what their definition of wilderness is. Is it restoring it to the way it was 100 years ago? Was it restoring to prior to immigrants coming to California? Is it prior to any people living on the planet? Those are issues that will help guide us in the future in planning. So does anybody have any thoughts on that? Faye or Monica? Or Brooke? Peter?
Yeah, Nick, sorry, could you rephrase a little bit of the question?
How do we define wilderness?
Wilderness, right?
National parks, their way of defining wilderness was when Western people came to California, because Native people had been modifying and managing nature for thousands of years. But then when it comes to legal terms of defining wilderness and what you can do there, what you can't do there, then you have to have a more nuanced description and definition of wilderness. So when we nowadays talk to government agencies, talk to kids about, gee, we want to restore the wilderness. So what is that? When is that? How do we do that? There's some basic information that we need to agree on prior to commencing with anything. So thoughts, Peter?
Yeah, so I would say that wilderness is an idea that we've created. It's a management style, and it comes from values rooted in this separation of people and nature, and those come out of Western thought and Western science. And so it's this compartmentalization of different disciplines, of different traditions, other things. And so I think that when you're picking like what wilderness to recreate or whatever, I think that gets into a dangerous territory, because we probably shouldn't be trying to recreate anything. And I think that when we're thinking about Native people, as Nick, and we talk about this all the time, we're not trying to necessarily go back. And that's such a misconception that people have, that Native traditions and Native knowledge are knowledge that it is from the past, exists in the past, it's our heritage, which it is our heritage, but it's an active way of being, it's an active way of understanding the landscape around us, and it's dynamic and adaptive. It's not static and kind of lifeless. If it didn't change, it would just be essentially dead, like a dead language. But like language, culture, and these other ideas, they continue to change and adapt. And that's indeed how we've survived through colonialism and all these other things that have happened to us throughout all these centuries. So the idea of wilderness, it goes back to kind of setting the environment in this static state that can't be changed. And like with climate change, everything will change whether we want it to or not, and it's going to get increasingly harder for us to manage for that sort of wilderness state, and we've got to have an active role. And so I think Indigenous people are leaders in really making that case for, these places have always been managed, and we need to continue to adapt and manage them, with our traditions, because we have the long view on what it has been, but also looking towards the future and what we need to be integrating in to change our practices with the changing times. So I guess that's how I would address that. Yeah.
So Brooke, I'm sorry, go ahead, Brooke.
Nick nailed that one. I would have very little to add, but just put a star on what he said around this, the ways that this concept of wilderness and a binary between humans and nature has been a colonial concept, and how much the just fundamental founding idea of our national parks and state parks and all of our like parks is this idea of like wilderness without people that erases Indigenous communities that have lived on those lands for forever. And so what's our way of like decolonizing our understanding of place? And I think part of that for us has been, I think so many folks know what they think the wilderness is around them, but have no understanding of some basic concepts of like, what watershed do you live in? Where does your water come from? What fiber shed do you live in? Where do these things come from? And so what are the ways that we, stop looking at our lands as having these borders and political borders, but also like wilderness versus human borders, and instead think about the sort of natural boundaries that exist of like, here's this river, here's this mountain, what watershed am I in? What food shed am I in? And trying to re-understand, and as you said, sort of remember our way forward that way. Yeah.
So Brooke, in your presentation, you mentioned something along the lines about equity among all things in nature. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Say again, like equity?
Equity among all things in nature. I was assuming that you meant between plants and animals and individual plants, or bumblebees and snakes or whatever. I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of our politic at Movement Generation, the work that we're doing is about trying to figure out how to get in right relationship with each other, and in right relationship with the land, and right relationship with the water, and right relationship with our pollinator relatives, our plant relatives. And so so much of there's maybe another way to say it is there's no boss in nature, right? You know how you show up at work and there's really clearly a boss. There's different roles that species play in ecosystems. But this concept that we have in the human world, that we've created this massive social inequity. We believe that among, so inequity between humans, right, fundamentally leads to ecological erosion. And so, I mean, I think just, one way to name that obviously is if we're thinking about the like shocks and shifts that we talked about, the two sort of founding shocks of what we now call the US, the kidnapping and enslavement of Black folks from Africa, the genocide of indigenous peoples, as two, on this land, as two of the biggest drivers of ecological devastation. And that we can't just think about like, I say that to say sort of like, oftentimes what we hear is people be like, oh, we need more solar panels, right? Or we need more electric cars, or like people want a technological fix to a problem that's fundamentally about actually how we relate to each other as people, and trying to figure out how we get back into right relationship with each other and with the land is at the heart of, for us, what that ecological restoration looks like.
And this might be a good opportunity to kind of build upon that and answer one of the questions from the Q&A about some of the key opportunities to use that shock of the last year to shift towards the livable planet that we'd like to see. So yeah, like what kind of opportunities do you see and what would like to advocate for? And Peter as well, if you want to answer that question.
Should I start, or do you want to start, Peter?
You can start. I was starting to respond to one of the other questions in the Q&A, but I'll respond after you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think this question of like, how do we harness the shocks of the last year toward the shifts that we're looking for? I mean, I think there've been lots of shocks, and so maybe the three just to name, like George Floyd and the sort of rebellion that came out of that, COVID, and then maybe for us in the Bay, it felt like wildfires. Maybe elsewhere it was other types of ecological devastation. I mean, I think on George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, I mean, I think the opportunity is like, talking about, at least in Oakland, talking about defunding or abolishing the police 5 years ago got you kicked out of the ring. Like, that was just why, like, people are like, that's never going to happen, in a way that now it feels like that's the conversation, and that there's a growing understanding that's not about tweaking at the edges of policing. It's not about racial sensitivity trainings or about body cameras, but this whole idea of policing coming out of slave catching is not the way to address harm and hurting in our community. And so some amazing ways in which people have harnessed that is, OUSD, the Oakland school system, and the San Jose school system have both banned school police, and that's happened in a bunch of other communities across the country. In Oakland, Oakland City Council just diverted, I think it was like 18 million, somebody correct me if I'm wrong on the numbers, of money away from the police department and put it toward community safety. There's now a mental health first hotline in Oakland. So if you're encountering domestic violence crisis, mental health or substance or addiction crises of folks on the street, that you can call first, that volunteers who are actually trained in that respond as opposed to the police. So I think that's exciting. I'll drop some links in of some of the stuff I'm talking about on the COVID front. I mean, I think this idea of like, if there's no work, there's no rent is surged during COVID. I think the eviction and foreclosure moratoriums that went into effect need to become cancel rent. And how do we detangle work from healthcare? This idea that the health of individuals relates to the health of the whole. I don't think we necessarily got healthcare for all out of that. I think that's a long fight. We also saw it was possible for cities to overnight, well, not overnight because it took us weeks of organizing, but still responding to pressure, put unhoused folks into hotels for months who didn't have a place to safely shelter. And that was actually cheaper and had better outcomes for everybody involved. So like, why can't we do that outside of COVID? We also saw that things that folks with disabilities have been pushing for years, like, can I have some accommodations to work from home, join this meeting by Zoom? All of a sudden companies overnight were like, oh yeah, let's do that for everybody. So like, where's the not going back around that? On the wildfires tip, I mean, I think this is more over the last couple of years, so less it's like shocks and slides, but I think this push to try to figure out how to bring PG&E as a, stock-owned company into community and worker control is really powerful. I think the everything that Peter said, obviously around Indigenous stewardship of fire and controlled burns and the growing public support for that. I also think the mutual aid networks that sprung up both around COVID and around the wildfires is phenomenal. This idea that like, actually it's not just our cities and county government that can respond, but whole community. You know, all of a sudden there were proliferation of Google Docs where folks just block by block were like, okay, who's on my block? Who needs food deliveries? Who needs checked in on once a day? And line volunteers up. And so like this idea of mutual aid and governing at that localist of level and directly meeting each other's needs is an idea that I think is needs to grow and is not going away, and came out of the shock of COVID. So I've got a couple links to some of the things I just mentioned. I'm going to drop them in the chat in case folks are like, hey, what was that organization you named? How do I find out more about that? So check and pass to Peter.
Sure. Yeah. So I think, you know, in recent years with all the wildfires going on, you know, we've seen a dramatic shift in people's attitudes towards prescribed burning, which is really, really great. You know, there are more programs now, more funding, and more support for doing this kind of work. You know, so a couple of those things, we're seeing legislation passed that, you know, helps out with especially liability issues for burn bosses. You know, and insurance and all of that has been a really huge factor in why, you know, more people don't get involved with this or can't. It's been prohibitive. You know, and so the more that expands, the more people will be able to have to do these kinds of burns more widely. You know, and funding is always an issue. You know, there have been more funds devoted to prescribed burning recently, but, you know, I think that, you know, there's always room for more on that front. Also, another thing that happened more recently is, you know, for years, California has relied on inmates for a lot of the wildfire crews. And so just recently, they've changed some of the rules to basically make it a lot easier for inmates who get all of that really great experience to be able to continue in a profession in wildland firefighting, whereas that would be really prohibitive for people you know, before those recent changes. And so, you know, there could be a lot more on that front as well, helping people, you know, who are going through the system and come out, you know, and want to continue in that profession to be able to do that. But, you know, given the number of people there that, again, are helping out, I mean, it just makes sense to do that. And, you know, that's one of the huge issues in wildland firefighting, especially, and these fuels crews is, you know, low staffing. And so, you know, on that level, on the level of getting more people trained in agency jobs, as well as, you know, people just locally, again, I can't, you know, speak highly enough of the Fire Forward program and Good Fire Alliance and all of those different really great programs and TREX programs around the state. You know, different tribes are involved in that as well. You know, so those programs are really developing those skills and knowledge and certifications for people to take care of their own communities. And the more support that we have for that kind of work and training and fielding these crews, the more people we're going to have around who can eventually, you know, hop on and help out when we do have a wildfire. But hopefully we'll get to the point where we're doing more prescribed burning than we, you know, do fighting fires. That would be the ideal situation. So, yeah.
So one of the questions that was submitted on the Q&A was about lightning strikes, and if there's been any studies on climate-induced dry lightning strikes, whether that's become more frequent or is it occurring in a different place? Do either of the panelists have any information on that?
I'd say that's slightly out of my wheelhouse. I know more, like theoretically, in the past, they aren't supposed to happen in really great frequency here. Obviously, the LNU fires were caused by, several hundred, lightning strikes around the Bay Area, which was, just extremely odd for this area. I don't know if that's increasing necessarily. I do know that climate is changing, and that those shifts in climate and weather and all of that, those conditions affect lightning, and definitely in terms of sort of drier conditions and prevailing winds and hotter temperatures and all of those kinds of things. Any spark from anywhere is more likely to set an area ablaze. So climate in that sense is definitely impacting what we have going on. But again, I'm not really versed in studies of lightning to be able to say one way or another if those are increasing or not. Yeah.
Brooke, any thoughts?
Definitely outside my wheelhouse.
Okay. Another one of the questions that was sent in is, are there any efforts that you are aware of to train people working on the front lines in a trauma-informed way? Either want to respond?
I'm wondering if whoever asked that, I'm trying to look through the Q&A. Is it Suzanne? Can say front lines to me, front lines of respond, like front lines of like, you're talking about like wildlands firefighters type front lines, or like social service workers or organizers, or maybe all the above?
All of the above is my opinion.
Yeah, okay. I don't know the specific. Maybe I'll just start with a thought, which is, and maybe somebody else can riff off of this, which is just, we come out of trauma, right? Everything that we're talking about is deeply traumatic and generational, upon generational and intergenerational trauma. And I think, speaking of like the shock of COVID and of other things, this past year, we haven't had a chance to grieve and to grieve collectively, and been having some conversations with friends about like, what would I don't think we're anywhere near this, but sometimes we just dream. So like, what is a general strike that allows us to grieve? Where's the week off? Where's the month off? How are we creating spaces in our movements to be able to grieve and to address that trauma, and then where are the places where we're caring for that trauma, and where, when we don't care for that trauma and create space for that trauma, do we end up acting in ways that put that trauma back on other folks. Oh, and I'm seeing in the thing, I think she means frontline communities. I see what you mean. That may be a different question. I might not be the best person, but I don't know. Other thoughts from folks?
This is Monica. I'm one of the co-facilitators here, and I just share a few thoughts. I'm also hopeful, like you, Brooke, that I'm thinking about my state agency that I work for, and I know that they're getting ready to work on reopening plans. We're all still remote for now, and one thing that a lot of workplaces are doing are reopening plans, and I think this acknowledgement of what we've been through in terms of the last year and a half, and obviously so many frontline communities for generations, I'm hopeful that there's an acknowledgement of that, and that that's being considered as we think about this new normal, and again, harnessing the shock of what we've been through. It's a little disconcerting, I think, sometimes as we see things reopening and things getting back to somewhat quote unquote normal a little quicker, but I would be hopeful and certainly put out a call to any of our attendees, if you are in leadership roles where you're working with workers or in any capacity, or the frontline communities that we work with on an adaptation context, that we really take to heart that the trauma of the last year and a half, but also the generations that come before, the way Brooke outlined, that that something needs to be done about that, not just spoken about, but we need to really lament and consider how that will inform our future. And I hope we don't move too quickly in just going back to the way things were. It's to kind of quote Peter, actually, we can't go back entirely, in an adaptation context or even in a socio-emotional context. So I'm hopeful that leaders on this call will take that into account.
And maybe I'll just also jump in. I want to uplift some of the work that Movement Generation has done for their Creative Wildfire initiative, where they talk a lot about, how can we resist going back to that normal that Monica was mentioning, and really, acknowledging that we've been through all these things and enough is enough, that we really want to be moving towards a reality that acknowledges all these traumas that we've been through, and that the people-led solutions are the things that really are going to be sustaining us in the future, and with all the uncertainties that we still have to face. So definitely also check out that initiative through Movement Generation and some of the work that they've been doing in coalition with other folks.
Yeah, and I think that this is a really important issue, and with speaking about wildfires, here in Santa Rosa and many other places in California now have experienced these massive wildfires. And so, there's trauma from that, people who have lost property or known friends who have lost property. They've seen it happen to their community. You drive through these places, and, so that could create barriers to all fire, people having resistance to accepting fire back into the land around them. And, because there's just this fear of fire because of the wildfires that we've seen, not really, discerning between the good fire, which is the cultural and prescribed burning, versus the wildfire. And I've definitely come into contact with that. And a lot of people who have been educating along those lines of trying to tease out, the benefits of good fire versus the destructive bad wildfire. So, you see that fear in the community, and I think it's working on the ground with people who are in these community-driven, community-led projects that are from these very same neighborhoods that people are deciding how to do fuels projects and other things, and relating to each other from neighbor to neighbor, that really connects with people and tries to deal with some of this trauma together because they're right in it. And lots of people have lots of fuel and they need to deal with that. And so I think that it's on that community level that people are starting to do that.
I wonder if I could just lift up one more organization on this trauma tip that we've learned a lot from, which is called the Healing Clinic Collective here in Oakland. It's some folks that came out of Movement Generation but formed their own organization that is a crew of now, I don't know, it must be like 40 different practitioners of folks who are body workers and massage folks, acupuncture, Reiki, herbal tinctures, to this is my vocabulary, or I'm familiar with it, like sort of talk, counseling and talk therapy, to limpias, to all of what it takes to support folks. And they've been doing it for years, mostly in neighborhoods where there's deep trauma, in Richmond and parts of Oakland, prioritizing folks who they and their families have been targets of state violence, coming out of mass incarceration, et cetera, but have also been doing that in response to the fires. So up in the North Bay, the North Bay Organizing Project worked with them to do Sanación del Pueblo, sort of healing of the people, and offering these services specific to what that, and it's all for free and very trauma informed, and then also gets folks to follow up care. And so I think that's a sort of, how do we, in this question of like participatory self-governance and caring for the people and not waiting for the state to come up with the programs that we know aren't going to serve us, just a really great example of what that looks like.
So here's a question for both of our speakers today. And when you look at climate change and methods to remediate it, Is anybody really focusing on identifying the potential impacts to cultural norms of any group? We talk about equity and including all, but is there anybody who's out there doing that already in an organized way that's scalable? Or are we just still ready to develop all those things? Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the the programs I've been working with do a really great job, again on the local level, and that focus, rather than stretching themselves too thin, like a bunch of the Trex programs or nationwide, and they bring in a lot of great people that they send back out all over the country, but they lose that expertise to other places, as opposed to keeping it within the community, and not to be closed off in any way to opportunities abroad, but there's something to be said for keeping those skills and certifications and people, that available crew, local. And so I think that is a really great model for training people to do these things. And it could be in firefighting and prescribed burning. It could be in another area, but it's a really great model of keeping that local, keeping those resources within our communities to serve those communities as well. And so what the Fire Forward program is doing, Good Fire Alliance, and others as well. I think that that's a really commendable program.
I don't have a lot to add to that, but I would just say, I think one of the things that on this question of like scalability and replicability that is worth us trying to figure out is that I think, especially when we're talking about planetary the collapse of the life systems of the planet, it's the largest possible problem we could in terms of scale you could think about, right? And so there's this tendency to think that the solutions to that problem have to be as big, right? That it's the Paris Climate Accords, or it's this like global agreements. But to be honest, those of us who are working with local communities, who are engaged in these fights, we know that we don't yet have the power to implement what we think we need materially, culturally, economically at that global level yet. Like if we're just, our honest power assessment is that we're not gonna win at that global scale, but that doesn't mean that, so I think it's worth someone saying like, well, where is it worth fighting? And so all of these programs that we're moving at a local level where we actually do have power, it's like, okay, where's the place where we can get the Forest Service to turn over fire stewardship to Indigenous communities? Where is the place where we can implement community land trusts to try to permanently take housing off the speculative market? Where is it that we can set up rainwater harvesting programs and gray water mandates? And where do we, throw in whatever examples you want? We're going to be able to win that stuff at the local level and prove that it's not only possible, but it's politically realistic, and it's what at one point was impossible or not deemed politically realistic, all of a sudden becomes inevitable. And so I think about the metaphor of like, it's not that it's the bowling ball that's the one big giant solution you're hurtling down. Okay, well, actually the bowler was the lane, the thing, but it's like, it's a bag of a 10,000 marbles, right? It's all of the little solutions where we actually do have the power at a local level to put forward these solutions, prove that they work, grab power and start, shifting, not power over, power with, but like the ability to implement some of those solutions. So I think I didn't articulate that well, but just trying to like the scale of the solutions doesn't have to always be on the scale of the problem.
So it's about 2:25. Julia, do you have any thoughts about how much more time we have?
Yeah, I think just with 5 minutes remaining, maybe Brooke and Peter would love to hear from you. Just some closing remarks. This is the kickoff webinar for the Advancing Equitable Adaptation track. Monica kind of went over some of the big challenges that the adaptation community is facing. You both illuminated additional challenges and some potential solutions, which is great, but would love to hear from you. Yeah, any final remarks, anything, any guidance or wisdom or even additional questions to share with our audience as they engage over the next few months on ways in which we can move our work, our adaptation work forward in a way that's centered around equity.
Do you want to go first, Peter? You want me to?
Either way, you can go first.
Okay. Thoughts not totally formulated, but I saw, maybe this is a way to answer a question that I saw in the chat, which was like, what are some of the creative things you're seeing or whatever? And it led me to think about, and this is also riffing off of the trauma stuff, is that like, oh, things are so hard and things have been so hard for so long. And it's easy for us to talk about what all the challenges are and wanna, maybe final thoughts is like, one of the things we say at MG is if it's not soulful, it's not strategic. Just as a way of like, how are, you know, it's so easy to get caught in like policy language or to also focus on the like downward spiral of the whole civilization we're experiencing. And like, where do we bring our music, our song, our stories, our, you know, even in the car caravans, the giant flags, these huge murals we're painting on the streets, the drum crews, the youth dancers, where our trauma-informed body work, you know, like where are we bringing joy and creativity and song and story and just like bringing the full brilliance of each of the very different communities we're involved in and bringing that to bear and not just having it be like, what's the policy language we're fighting for? And so I know I like deeply respect our policy and research nerds and the folks that translate all that, but like, how do we reground ourselves in joy and brilliance and fun and creativity as we move forward? And I'm not always that person, but want to just put that as an invitation to all of us on this Monday afternoon. Check.
Yeah, and I guess continuing from there too, you know, really knowing ourselves and being open to others too is a good starting place, you know, in terms of having these really tough conversations where we bridge or find the intersections in our values and perspectives. And, you know, I feel like that's really important for working collaboratively, you know, which is incredibly important for working with Indigenous communities, people of color, you know, and getting those services to people who need them in an equitable way. You know, so I think that that's the heart of community-based work is, you know, that openness to being able to be shifted yourself and, you know, have your work shifted in ways that you may not have expected. And so that, you know, that challenges your idea of what you may think you're about and, you know, where you're headed. But I think it's very important to do that. And it can lead to some really great places that, you know, just have so much more value for so many more people. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much to both of you for being here today. And we've got 1 minute, which is exactly enough time to wrap up here. Thank you all for joining today in our very first webinar for the CAF. I invite you all to come back on Monday, July 26th for the first interactive webinar from 10 to 12, where we'll cover a bit about white supremacy characteristics in the workplace, how they're related to climate adaptation, and then strategies for dismantling that. Because again, like as we're all practitioners in equitable adaptation, if we're not starting and grounding in that racial justice framework, it doesn't really matter what else we're doing on the climate policy end. So again, thank you for joining us today and hope to see you again on July 26th. And we'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.